The private dining room at Maison Carteret in downtown Montreal was the kind of place where secrets arrived in leather folders and left in sealed envelopes. The walls were upholstered in dove-grey silk. The lighting was calibrated to make everyone look slightly more important than they actually were. And on the night that changed everything, the woman refilling the water glasses was the only person in the room who understood exactly what was about to happen. Her name was Vivian, 29 years old, 3 years of a law degree at McGill, abandoned in her second semester of third year when her mother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, and the medical bills began arriving faster than Vivian could answer them. Before that, she had been the kind of student professors remembered, the kind who asked questions that made other students shift in their seats. She had a particular gift for contract law, for reading the fine print that everyone else glossed over, for finding the sentence buried in Clause 14 that undid everything in Clause 1. Now she wore a white linen shirt and a black apron, and carried a crystal pitcher of still water around a table where 6 people in Italian suits were negotiating a deal worth $200 million. She was not supposed to have opinions. She was not supposed to exist, really, in any meaningful sense. The maitre d', a thin man named Forsyth, who had worked at Maison Carteret for 19 years, had briefed the serving staff that morning with the particular combination of anxiety and condescension he reserved for high-value bookings. Private dinner, client. Korean delegation. You pour, you clear, you disappear, he had said, looking at each of them in turn. You are not there. Vivian had nodded along with the others. She needed this job. She needed every shift she could get. The Korean businesswoman seated at the head of the table was named Park Soo-yeon, 61 years old, founder and executive chair of Soo-yeon Holdings, a conglomerate that had started as a textile manufacturer in Busan and had, over 4 decades, grown into a company with interests in logistics, pharmaceutical distribution, and commercial real estate across 7 countries. She had flown in from Seoul that morning on a private flight, accompanied by her personal assistant, a young woman named Chae-young, who sat 2 chairs to her left and said almost nothing. Park Soo-yeon did not speak English. This was not a secret. It was simply a fact that the men across the table had failed to adequately prepare for. The man leading the Canadian side of the negotiation was Callum Broderick, Managing Director of Broderick Capital Partners, a private equity firm headquartered in Toronto that had recently expanded to Montreal. He was 53, well-tanned for October, and wore the kind of confidence that comes not from competence but from never having been seriously challenged. Beside him sat his legal counsel, a man named Gareth Quinn, and across from them, representing a third party with undisclosed interests in the deal, a man who had introduced himself only as Whitmore. They had brought a translator. That was what they'd told Park Soo-yeon's office when the dinner was arranged. A certified interpreter would be present for the duration of the evening. The interpreter had not shown up. Broderick had explained this to Chae-young 15 minutes into the dinner, his voice carrying the particular apologetic smoothness of someone who is not actually apologetic. A miscommunication with the agency, a scheduling conflict. Deeply regrettable. In the meantime, they had a translation application on the tablet that had been placed on the table, and surely that would serve well enough for the broad strokes. Park Soo-yeon had listened to Chae-young relay this, and had not changed her expression at all. She had simply folded her hands in her lap and looked at the tablet, and then looked at Broderick. And Vivian, refilling water glasses at the sideboard, had watched the whole exchange and thought, she already knows something is wrong. The dinner proceeded in the strange fractured rhythm of conversations conducted through a machine. Broderick would speak a sentence. Chae-young would type it into the tablet. The tablet would produce a Korean translation, and Park Soo-yeon would read it, and then she would reply in Korean, and the tablet would produce an English translation, and then Broderick would nod and say something else. The translations were adequate for pleasantries. They were not adequate for the kind of nuanced legal language that Broderick was beginning to introduce, casually, as if it was simply the natural flow of dinner conversation. Vivian noticed this the way she noticed most things, quietly, without drawing attention to herself. She moved around the table with the water pitcher. She watched Chae-young's face as she read the English translations of what Broderick was saying, watched the slight furrow between the young woman's brows that she was working hard to smooth out. The deal, as Vivian had pieced it together from fragments over the course of the evening, was a joint venture. Park Soo-yeon's company would inject capital into a Canadian logistics network that Broderick Capital was restructuring. A $140 million commitment from the Korean side. In exchange, equity stake, board representation, and revenue sharing over 12 years. It sounded, on the surface, like a reasonable arrangement, but sometime around the main course, rack of lamb with herb jus, a dish that cost more than Vivian made in a day, Quinn slid a document across the table, and Broderick said, in his warm, reassuring voice, that this was simply a letter of intent. A framework. Nothing binding yet, just a signal of good faith from both parties, so that the formal agreements could be drafted with clarity. Vivian was standing 2 feet away, clearing an unused bread plate. She saw Quinn's hand hover over the document for just a moment before he pushed it forward. She saw the section heading on page 3, which had been left visible as the document fanned slightly open. She had read enough contract law to know what she was looking at. The clause was in what litigators called the governing terms, buried under the section on dispute resolution, printed in the same font size as everything else, giving no indication that it was the most consequential sentence in the document. It designated as the binding legal jurisdiction for any disputes arising from the joint venture, not Canadian courts, not Korean courts, but a private arbitration body registered in Delaware, with arbitrators selected exclusively from a roster maintained by an organization that, if Vivian remembered correctly from a third-year commercial law seminar, had a documented history of rulings that disproportionately favored North American corporate interests over foreign investors. This alone might have been something Park Soo-yeon's legal team would flag and negotiate, but there was a second clause, connected to the first by language so technical and interlocking that you had to hold both paragraphs in your head simultaneously to understand what they were actually saying together. If a dispute arose and arbitration was invoked before the formal joint venture agreement was executed, the financial obligations of both parties defaulted to the terms of this letter of intent, and the letter of intent in its appendix contained a valuation schedule that locked in the Korean side's capital contribution at the committed amount, regardless of what the final agreement said, while the Canadian side's equity obligations were left floating, subject to renegotiation upon the triggering of arbitration. In plain language, if anything went wrong, Park Soo-yeon's company stood to lose its entire $140 million commitment with no legal recourse that it could realistically exercise. The dispute mechanism was designed to trigger the clause that eliminated the value of what it was supposedly there to protect. Vivian set the bread plate down on the trolley behind her. She stood there for a moment with her hands very still at her sides. She thought about Forsyth's voice that morning. "You are not there." She thought about her mother's physiotherapist appointment on Friday and the invoice that had arrived last week from the neurologist's clinic, the one she hadn't opened yet because she already knew the number on it, was going to require her to do calculations she didn't want to do. She thought about the fact that she was 3 months away from having saved enough to resume her degree part-time, if nothing else went wrong. She thought about the woman at the head of the table, who had folded her hands politely in her lap and was now being asked to sign a document she could not fully read, in a language she did not speak, negotiated by men who had shown up to this dinner without a human interpreter. Vivian picked up the water pitcher. She walked to the head of the table. "Would you like still or sparkling, Miss Park?" She said it in Korean. Her Korean was not perfect. It never had been. She had learned it during 3 years of an undergraduate minor in East Asian languages, and then continued on her own, partly out of stubbornness and partly because she had found, during her law studies, that Korean corporate contract conventions were genuinely interesting to her. She was fluent enough to hold a professional conversation, fluent enough to be precise. The table went quiet. Chae-young looked up from the tablet with an expression Vivian would remember for a long time, not just surprise, but something that looked like relief. Park Soo-yeon turned her head slowly and looked at Vivian with the particular attention of someone who has spent 60 years in business and knows the difference between an interesting coincidence and a significant development. Her dark eyes moved from Vivian's face to the water pitcher to Vivian's face again. "Still, please," she said in Korean. And then, after a pause, "You speak Korean. Enough to be useful," Vivian said in Korean. "If you want me to be." Across the table, Broderick had gone very still. Quinn was watching the exchange with an expression he was working hard to make seem neutral. Whitmore had set down his fork. "What's going on?" Broderick said, to no one in particular. His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it. "What is she saying?" Nobody answered him. Park Soo-yeon looked at Vivian for another moment. Then she said, still in Korean, "What do you do when you're not serving water?" Vivian said, "I used to study law. At McGill. I had to stop. Why? My mother became ill. The cost of her care." Park Soo-yeon nodded, slowly, as if this explained something larger than just the specific circumstance. Then she said, "And what do you think of the document on this table?" The room was completely silent now. Even Forsyth, who had appeared at the far door at the sound of an unfamiliar language and was now standing very still with his hands clasped behind his back, did not move. Vivian said, carefully, "I think you should read clauses 14 and 15 together, and then read the valuation appendix before you sign anything." Broderick pushed back his chair. "Now wait a minute," he said, and his voice had changed, the smoothness gone. "This is a private dinner. You have absolutely no business, Broderick." It was Whitmore who said it, quietly. "Sit down." Broderick sat down. Park Soo-yeon took the document from the table. She turned to page 3. She read it slowly with the unhurried focus of someone who had not become who she was by rushing through important pages. Chae-young, who had been increasingly tense throughout the evening, leaned over and read alongside her employer. At some point, she whispered something. Park Soo-yeon nodded without looking up. Vivian stood with the water pitcher and did not move. She was aware, distantly, that her job was probably over. She was also aware that she could not have done anything different. Some calculations were very simple, when you stripped away everything that was supposed to complicate them. After several minutes, Park Soo-yeon set the document down. She looked at Broderick. She spoke in Korean, and her voice was clear and even and did not raise itself by even a fraction. Chae-young translated, "Mrs. Park says that she has been building companies since before Mr. Broderick was managing capital. She says she has seen this kind of language before. She simply did not expect to see it here, at a dinner where she was told a qualified interpreter would be present. Chae-young paused. She says she finds it interesting that the interpreter did not arrive. Broderick opened his mouth. Park Soo-yeon spoke again before he could. Chae-young translated. She is not signing this document. She would like Mr. Broderick to understand that this does not mean she is uninterested in a partnership. It means that she is interested in a partnership conducted in good faith, and that she will be sending this document to her own legal team in Seoul tonight, and that any future meeting will include a certified interpreter, sourced independently. A pause. By her office. Broderick looked at Quinn. Quinn looked at the table. Whitmore, to his credit or his pragmatism, said, "That's entirely reasonable." Forsyth appeared at Vivian's elbow. "A word," he said very quietly. She followed him out through the service door and into the corridor beyond, where the kitchen noise filtered through the walls and the air smelled of butter and reduction sauces. "I'm sorry," she said, before he could speak. "I know what it looked like." Forsyth looked at her for a long moment. He was not, she had always sensed, a cruel man. He was simply a man who had spent 19 years maintaining a precise and fragile order, and who felt the disruption of that order in his chest. "Do you have any idea," he said, "what it will mean if that table complains?" "I think it's more likely that table will not want anyone looking too closely at this evening," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably true." Another pause. "You speak Korean?" "Yes, you didn't mention that when I hired you. It didn't seem relevant to carrying plates." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he said, "Go back to the floor. We'll talk about this later." She went back to the floor. The dinner ended without ceremony. Broderick called for the bill with the focused energy of a man who wanted to leave as quickly as possible without appearing to want to leave. Quinn gathered the document from the table with careful hands. Whitmore said very little to anyone. Park Soo-yeon rose at the end of the meal with the composure of a woman who had survived far more inconvenient evenings than this one. She said something to Chae-young. Chae-young approached Vivian, who was clearing a side table near the door. "Mrs. Park would like a moment," she said. Vivian set down the stack of side plates she was holding. Park Soo-yeon stood near the window that looked out over the lights of old Montreal. The cobblestones illuminated from below, the St. Lawrence dark beyond the old port. She waited until Vivian reached her, and then she turned, and in the unhurried way that seemed to characterize everything she did, she studied Vivian for a moment. Then she spoke in Korean. "You gave up your legal studies to care for your mother." "To pay for her care," Vivian said. "She can still mostly care for herself. She just can't work anymore. Parkinson's." Vivian nodded. Park Soo-yeon was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I started my first company when my father's textile factory closed. He had worked there for 30 years. There was no severance. The owner declared bankruptcy, and the employees received nothing. I was 24. I knew nothing about business." She paused. "I knew enough about injustice." Vivian didn't say anything. There didn't seem to be anything to say. "My company is opening a Canadian office," Park Soo-yeon said. "Not with Broderick Capital. With someone else, I will find someone else. But I will need a Canadian legal liaison, someone who understands Korean business culture, someone who can read what the document actually says." She paused. "Someone who, when presented with a choice between their own security and doing the right thing, makes the right choice without making a speech about it." Vivian felt something shift in her chest. It was a strange sensation. Not relief exactly, and not joy. Something quieter than both. The feeling of a door she had thought was permanently closed opening just slightly, just enough to let the light through. "I'm 3 years out of law school," she said. I only have 2 years completed. I'm aware. I asked Chae-young to look you up while we were sitting at that table. Park Soo-yeon allowed herself a small, precise smile. I like to know who I'm speaking with. I'd need to finish my degree, yes. The position won't open for 10 months. I would expect you to have made some progress by then. A pause. And the salary during that period can be arranged so that your mother's medical costs are not a deciding factor. Vivian looked at her. Why? It was a genuine question, not a protest. Park Soo-yeon looked out at the lights of Montreal for a moment. Because I have been the person at the table who could not read the document, she said, and no one said anything. She looked back at Vivian. You said something. That is not a small thing. Forsyth found her at the end of service, when the last table had been cleared, and the dining room was being reset, and the kitchen was beginning to wind down. The Korean delegation left a gratuity, he said. He handed her an envelope. She opened it. It was more money than she had made in the past 2 months combined. There was a card inside. Plain cream stock, with a name and a Seoul address printed in clean type, and below that a handwritten note in Korean. For the McGill student who remembered why she was studying law in the first place. Call when you're ready. Forsyth watched her read it. I'm not going to pretend to understand what happened in that room tonight, he said. No, she agreed, but for what it's worth. He paused. You were right. Anyone who's been in this business as long as I have knows the difference between someone causing trouble and someone doing what's right. Vivian folded the card back into the envelope. Thank you, Forsyth, she said. He nodded and went back to his accounting, because that was what he did, and she gathered her coat from the staff room and walked out through the back of Maison Carteret into the October night. The streets of old Montreal were quiet at this hour. The cobblestones shone under the street lamps. Somewhere near the water, a church bell was counting out a late hour. She could see her breath in the cold air, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, the sky was that particular deep blue that only happens in Canadian autumn, the kind of blue that doesn't last and that you want to hold on to because of that. She thought about her mother, who would be sleeping now in their apartment on Rue Beaubien, and about the invoice she hadn't opened, and about the cost of the physiotherapy and the medication and all the quiet arithmetic of a life structured around someone else's need. She thought about Park Soo-yeon, 61 years old, who had started her first company at 24 because of an injustice that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. She thought about the clause on page 3 and how it had almost worked, and what it would have meant if it had. Then she started walking in the direction of the metro, through the cold and the quiet, and the kind of night that feels, if you are open to it, like it might be the last of one thing and the first of something else entirely. The city spread out around her, enormous and indifferent and full of possibility, the way cities always are for people who have finally decided to take up the space they were always meant to occupy. She did not walk fast. There was no reason to hurry now. The evening had already arranged itself into something she would spend years unpacking. The weight of the water pitcher in her hand, the silence when she had spoken Korean in a room that had not expected it, the look on Chae-young's face that she would always describe when she told this story as the look of someone who had been holding their breath for an hour and had finally been given permission to exhale. She had said something. That was all. She had said something when saying nothing would have been easier and safer and far more convenient. It turned out that was enough.